Welcome back to Curiosity, Not Judgment with Birga and Gary. We've decided to go round 2 on the subject of opposites attract, or do they, or until they don't. You know, you phrase it however makes most sense in your mind. Last time we kind of talked politics and business, we did talk politics and business, and today we want to talk more about marriage and, I guess, personal relationships. So, many of us have had the experience of playing with literal magnets, right? Where you switch the poles and, at one way they stick together very quickly and they're very hard to pull apart. Flip it around the other way and you can't get them to touch unless you put a whole lot of brute force behind it. And it's, something that gets introduced probably in elementary school and as you begin to learn about the poles and all those different kinds of things. And when we think about that concept of attraction and repulsion in relationships and especially in marriage, I would imagine that we have our unique ways of approaching that and viewing that. And we have that expression in our popular culture that opposites attract. And I think to a large degree, that's really true. But there is something really comfortable about matching poles. Mm-hmm. There's something really comfortable about being able to be in relationship with someone who thinks and operates like you. And so I want to talk about those different dynamics.
Yeah, and I tell you, in the movies, which absolutely has no relationship with true love and marriage, but in the movies, you often find people who, can finish each other's sentences, mm-hmm. and that's the indication that there's going to be a great love match. Mm. And I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, that's not how it works, mm-hmm. right? And I mean, I think let me start with a statement that maybe the ideal gas law, in other words, in engineering, you hear about the ideal gas law. Nothing is exactly that, but you start with that to say, here's how we can predict what we think is going to happen, and then you kind of go into the practical world, which is not perfect, and state that there are going to be, in any relationship, things that you see eye to eye on and that are perfectly matched. Mm-hmm. You both like to go to movies. You both like to go bowling. You both like to, there's activities. You met on the tennis court, mm-hmm. right? You're both marathon runners, right? Those things are really important. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's going to be other things where the perspective is totally different, right? And I would submit that depending on your tolerance level, the best relationships are those where there are some commonalities, but then there are some vast differences that provide the challenge and the growth in the relationship. Because I tell you, I don't want to be myself personally or in a relationship that is just stale and ho-hum and has no challenge and no growth. All living things grow through struggle. One of your main relationships in life, if we're talking about marriage, if you're talking about a long-standing relationship, there ought to be growth. Mm-hmm. And if there's growth, then by definition, there's struggle. Because none of us grows when everything's easy. Right. There's no reason to, right? And sometimes I think we get a little lazy. And we think, well, it'd be easier if there was no struggle. But the problem is then there's no growth. Right. If that's your goal, that's great. Go try to find somebody who you match up with on every single thing.
Probably be single forever.
My point. Yeah. And so I think when we're thinking about this, it's true that that you want to do certain things, especially with respect to activities, certain things in common. Mm-hmm. You don't want to marry somebody who you love to go out to eat and this person hates going out to eat, as an example. But I know a lot of couples where one of them likes to dance and the other one doesn't like to dance, right? So on an activity level, you want to find some common ground, but it doesn't have to be universal. On an emotional level, on a personality level, it's good if there's some differences. I mean, how many times have you heard of someone say, I really appreciated growing up in this household. My father was like this, and I got this from him. And my mother was like this, and I got that from her. Mm-hmm. And I was able to take the best of both, and I really feel like that's who I am. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot of merit to that. very rarely do you see both parents being exactly the same.
Sure. I think about the phrase of not being unequally yoked, and that comes from the principle of having two oxen in a wooden or some sort of a harness, right? And if you've got two oxen that are pulling in opposite directions, you're never going to plow your field.
Right.
They have to work in harmony, but they are independent. They are both uniquely strong. They both have their, whatever desires, I suppose. I don't want to oversimplify this, but I think there is something to be said for finding someone in partnership where your eyes are on the same goal, but you have your individual strengths.
Have you ever been canoeing?
No.
Oh, well, so the person who's in front and the person who's in the back have incredibly different jobs.
Okay.
If you're just two amateurs out rowing, which is actually kind of fun to watch, you might think, well, it's important that both of you are rowing at the exact same pace in the exact same way, right?
In the same cadence?
Same cadence would be a good thing to think about, right?
I would assume.
Okay. What about which side of the boat you row on?
I would imagine opposites.
Okay. And if both people are in the exact same cadence, rowing on the exact opposite side of the boat, you should go straight?
If they're both using the same force, I would think.
Try it sometime.
Okay. I'm guessing
it's almost impossible to do.
Okay.
So what happens is you've got the person in the back who's kind of acting as stroke and rudder, and then you've got the person in the front who's doing more of just the strokes, although they can do some pulling across the bow, they can do some steering, but you've got the person in the back who is rowing and actually doing a little bit of ruddering also, and usually different sides of the boat. Anyway, the first time I ever tried this with a partner, and it was a business partner, by the way, it was laughable. We were like going in circles. But once we figured out, and by the way, we had a common goal straight down the river.
Yep.
Once we figured out how to do it, it was just a lot of fun. But we realized that we had totally different roles. We ended up switching because I was in the back at first and they were in the front. And we ended up saying, okay, you know what? I'm better in the front. You're better in the back. Here's what we're going to have to do. And it worked out great. But there was a little bit of give and take there. And it was doing things differently, but yielding the right result. And I think that's what any successful relationship is like. It is, okay, first of all, establishing the common goal, learning in a river situation to follow the bubbles, by the way, very important. Because if you don't follow the bubbles, you're going to hit ground, and then you both have to get up and do portage, which is called walking your canoe, which is never fun. But once you figure that out, then you have to figure out how your roles, your specific roles, and how they go within the boat. And I think that's the key. How do we figure out our own different roles in the same vessel to go the place we want to go?
Ooh, this is a very good visual for me. So I can imagine in your story, at some point when you have the conversation, we need to switch roles.
Yes.
I'm better in this spot, you're better in that spot. To physically maneuver past one another without tipping the boat over is no small thing.
No, nor is it the acceptance that we need to switch roles. At first it's like, I know what I'm doing. What are you talking about? And it turned out to be the key to our success, but it wasn't obvious at first, right? And so, and there's, even within those roles, there's overcorrecting and undercorrecting and different things to do. And so, and sometimes it's, you know what, I'm okay at this role, you're okay at this role, but if we try to do it the opposite way, it's a disaster, right? And it's not like you're not going for perfection, right? You're going for progress, right?
Yeah. Wow. So I'm now immediately applying.
We have to go canoeing sometime.
We have to go canoeing. Can you tell I grew up in New Mexico where there's no water? Where there's a very practical situation, maybe something that's rubbing wrong in marriage, and I'm thinking finances, right? You said early up on in this episode, somebody is the
Loves to balance the checkbook.
Yeah, and somebody else
balance to
doesn't.
zero, and the other one's like, hey, I've got checks left. I must have money.
Right. So if there becomes this realization that you're in the wrong seat, so to speak, how do you begin that transition so that you don't dump the boat? And it begins with us having to let go of some pride issues, right? I mean, because
usually most things start with
sure.
let it go of pride issues.
Well, but I mean, there's a whole lot of judgment involved, right? You didn't do this job well, now I've got to take over, or you didn't do this, now I have to fill in the blank. So we got to get rid of the judgment, we got to get rid of the pride stuff, and we got to start asking some questions about how do we transition roles so we don't sink the ship.
So the first step in that is this working or not? And usually if you're arguing about it, it's not.
Right.
So then comes the realization of, okay, unless we, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. So what can we do different? Okay, look, I was in the situation where I was the person saying, look, I must have money, I've got checks left, and my wife had to balance to the penny every time. I thought that was ridiculous. She thought my position was ridiculous. What we ended up doing, and I hated this at first, but then realized afterwards that it was much less overall strife long term, is we decided that every Sunday we would sit down and discuss the checkbook and the credit cards.
Okay.
And the credit card statement. And it was a pain. It's like, well, what's this one? What's this one? What's this one? Well, look, I don't spend money on stupid stuff. Why are you questioning me?
Of course not. I can imagine this conversation. Go ahead.
So, but what we eventually got around to is, okay, look, I'm going to support you doing a little bit over here because I think that's ridiculous use of money, but you know what? It brings you happiness and joy, fine. And the same thing over here. But the point was, once we figured that out, it was the first time we ever kind of agreed on money. Look, money is one of the biggest problems in marriages.
Absolutely.
And figuring out how to manage money and whether or not you really need to go with a budget or an envelope system or one of these other things that goes saying, if you don't know what an envelope system is, just Google it. But if you can't figure out how the money is being spent, you're going to be in some serious troubles. That's going to be the source of a lot of disagreements, which is going to spill over into other things. I think it's really important to nip things in the bud that are problems, even though you both want to avoid them. And I am the biggest avoider of conflict and problems. But I've learned over the years, and it took on many of them, that if you avoid the problem when it's small, it's just going to get bigger.
Yeah.
Always. You cannot avoid it. And so figuring out an acceptable way, and talk about compromise, an acceptable way to manage the budget, the money in the house, whether it's a budget or not. A budget is kind of like a diet. People say, I need to go on a diet. Well, the diet is the food you eat. Going on a diet doesn't make any sense. Adjusting your diet makes all the sense in the world. It's the same thing with a budget. Whether or not you are formally doing a budget or not, you have a budget.
Sure.
There's so much in and there's so much out, and you hopefully that's about equal, or ideally there's a little bit extra so you can do some savings. Right. How you arrive at that is going to be unique to you as an individual and to a couple.
Absolutely. All right, staying on the money train for a second, but slightly different angle. If you've got a spender and a saver, and it continually becomes a source of conflict, how do we get curious about the other person's position, and how do we ask questions so that there's hope for finding some common ground?
It's a very important question. So I think taking what you can't do is come and say you can't just put your criticism in the form of a question.
Right.
It's like,
why do you always spend so much?
Exactly.
Right.
Or why do you think we need to save 17 months of salary in our savings account and you're not happy until then? I think the better question is, so how much do we want to put aside for certain things, like vacation, like college fund, like emergency repairs for vehicles? we've got to have, we know we have to fund those things.
Mm-hmm.
Are we okay with it just being a surprise when it happens?
Mm.
And if the answer is no, and maybe it's yes,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have a different conversation, and maybe you have to wait until the pain is great enough after you've had a couple of surprises, and there's been things you can't do because these surprises came up, and the pain is enough that then the person is ready to change behavior. Yeah. It's very difficult to change behavior, and you know that whole motivational interviewing is the formal term for it, but on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you want to change the way we're doing our budget?
Mm.
And then on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think, how successful do you think we'll be in agreeing on how to do that? Right?
Wow.
Right? I mean, that's an easy thing to start with. And if the answer is 1 and 1, well, then just keep doing status quo.
Yeah.
Right? If the answer is, you know what, I don't like the way this is going, and I'm willing to sit down and talk about it, even though I don't want to, and I think the way you handle things is ridiculous.
Maybe don't phrase it like that, but
You know, but this is what you're feeling, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be transparent at some level.
yeah.
I mean, look, I read a book a few months ago that said, and it made this statement, and I had to really think about it. You will not grow in your life if there is not at least one person in your life that you can be totally honest with.
Mm.
Everything. Totally honest with. And so if that's not your marriage partner, there's going to be issues.
For sure.
You know, so, you know, if you can make that commitment that, you know what, no matter what the subject, I'm going to be totally honest with you. That goes a long way. And then you can say things like, really frustrates me that you spend so much money on X.
Yeah.
Or it really frustrates me that you feel like we don't have to save money at all. Or it really frustrates me that you have no plan for the kids to go to college. Well, my parents didn't pay for my college. I don't feel there's responsibility for paying for the. Oh, well, that's good to know.
Right.
I mean, but you can't get there until you have those conversations and start asking questions.
Oh, and the questions are so important, and in understanding motivation. And so, back to this concept of spend versus save, and how we operate within the context of our marriage and finances. What I was thinking about in asking some of those questions to break down those judgmental barriers is, maybe this doesn't even get asked out loud at first. Maybe it's an internal asking, and begin to do some sleuthing, so to speak. Why is this such an important issue? Or why does, my partner feel so strongly about this? What's something that maybe has happened in their past or in their upbringing that's causing them to think this way? And when you've got somebody who's grown up in poverty versus somebody who's grown up in affluence, and the children of those two families come together, can you bet there's going to be
absolutely
some serious disagreements on how to process money. And you can fill in the blank with all different types of scenarios from family upbringing and, what you've seen modeled. And so asking some of those questions and trying to understand the root behind them not only helps with the communication, but I think gives an empathy that you don't have otherwise.
No question. My parents grew up, living parts of the Depression. And my dad saved ketchup packs and my mom saved tinfoil. I think they still do. And they don't need to do that anymore, from a financial standpoint. But it just is ingrained with them. And if you ask my dad, do you really need to save those ketchup? Well, it's just something I started doing. I'm going to do it. Another one from money is conflict resolution. Oh my goodness. I came from a Norwegian home where raising your voice was tantamount to war. And I never saw my parents argue once. They went to their room and had discussions. Right? And now I picked up later on in life as a teenager with some nonverbal cues, but they refused to raise their voice in the house.
Yeah.
Versus my wife, who came from a Catholic family, and the first dinner I ever went to their house, I thought they hated each other. I mean, they were screaming at each other and screaming just to be heard over each other. Was there any more love in this household than the other? No. It was a total different approach and motivation. And when one partner thinks that you need to scream and argue things out, and you're not going to bed, you're not walking out of this room until we resolve this, and we're going to scream at each other until it happens. And you've got another one who's just like, I have no experience with that, and I don't understand it, and I don't know what you're doing, but I don't like it.
Yep.
It makes me nervous and intimidated. There has to be some common ground there, right?
I don't know if I've said this to you before, but my exposure to my husband's family, I felt very much like I was living through my big fat Greek wedding. Even though he's not Greek, they're from Bolivia, but that similar dynamic. And I felt like I came from the dry toast family, and he was the family with the food and the flavor, and it was just a clash of cultures that took a very long time to adjust to.
That's right.
Not just in eating and in personality and in conversation at the dinner table, but it infiltrates everything.
I really believe in the commitment of marriage. And so therefore, when these types of wonderful things that you get to resolve and work through come up, the only thing that you can do poorly is to just ignore and hope those will go away. Because when people are under stress, these past experiences are going to come out.
Yep.
Those unresolved traumas, micro traumas, I like to call them, those little things from our past are going to come out in big ways. And if the more people can understand that about each other and ask, why is it that the response is this when I do this? Figure out what those triggers are, the better. And the more you can have calm conversations about that. So sometimes you have to take a little bit of a break and then come back to it. One thing, that is good is to, when you've got a lot of conflict, is to write letters to each other, and to try to be as vulnerable as you can. When you do this, it really makes me uncomfortable. I don't know why. Maybe it's because of this, and this when I was a kid, or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then just read the letters to each other, or read the other person's out loud. There's several techniques, and we're not marriage counselors here, but there are ways to, the main thing is to try. The techniques are way less important than the motivation that, I'm for you, you're for me, we're in this together, let's commit to staying in this together, we've got these issues, what can we do differently?
Yeah. Well, and amazingly enough, this comes back to the theme of this entire podcast is curiosity, not judgment. And if you can allow yourself to enter into that space when conflict has arisen and you're feeling that tension, that the opposite that's making you pull away from one another, if you can step back out of that place of, you always do this, or you're always that way, or, whatever your immediate thought process is to, I wonder why, fill in the blank. If you can just internally start the reset with that question, and then get to the point where you can vocalize some honoring questions, some I was going to say safe questions. They're not all safe, because sometimes they're going to be a little bit scary to ask.
Love is not safe. Right.
But if you can get to that point where you can ask the genuine questions with the motivation to hear the answer, that is where curiosity is going to help make a huge difference in your relationship.
That's right. It's like things don't get fixed the first time you try something, and things don't get fixed overnight or immediately. But if you're bent, your overall bent and trend is towards trying to resolve things in positive ways versus just leaving things alone and hoping they go away, the former usually works better than the latter in my experience.
Yep. I think that's well put. All right. Comments, questions, feedback. We always love to hear what's on your mind. Please, write us a note, write us a comment. Let us know how this conversation has impacted you. So curiositynotjudgment.com is the website. And of course, you can comment on any of the platforms that have that type of thing available. We've got a Facebook page. We try to make ourselves readily available, so please do let us know what you're thinking. So until next time, we'll ask you to stay curious.
Take care.